even if you really like how great their handshake was and how nice their smile was at the beginning. You know, the best predictor of actual job performance is if you're hiring a marketing leader. You know, give them a little bit of context and say, come up with a marketing plan or develop a marketing presentation so you can actually see how someone works through the problem and ask questions about those things in live time. Why did you make this choice over that choice? Walk me through what your process looked like to get here. What was the data that you didn't have, but you wished I would have given you? How did you make this assumption? You know, and you're starting to get more into how does a person think? What's the way they're going to solve these problems? And you're sort of evaluating, like, does that match the competency we're looking for in this role? So, for example, we might want someone who's a little more of a non-linear, divergent, abstract thinker because you want to come up with some kind of creative stuff. And so if they don't demonstrate any of that in that work sample, and you know that that's a competency you want, you can sort of bump that person down the list, even if you really like how great their handshake was and how nice their smile was at the beginning. You know, like you start to bump against some of that. That'll get you even closer to who's a good candidate.
Welcome to Builders, the podcast for impact-driven leaders who are done carrying it all and ready to scale with clarity, strategy, and freedom. I'm your host, Alex Snyder, strategic growth architect, creator of the CEO Recode, and second brain to leaders who are building brilliant companies without sacrificing every ounce of their time, energy, or sanity. Each episode, I sit down with bold leaders who've rebuilt, recalibrated, or redefined what it means to lead well and live well on their own terms. We talk messy pivots, leadership upgrades, tactical wins, and the deep personal work it takes to build a business that actually works for you. If you love the episode, make sure you follow, rate, and share it with another leader who's building big and wants to build smarter. And if you're listening and thinking, damn, I need someone in the guts of my business with me, let's talk. Book your free business breakdown call using the link in the show notes. In 30 minutes, I'll help you pinpoint where blockers in your time, team, or strategy are silently stalling your growth and define 2 to 3 high-impact shifts you can implement now to regain traction and build momentum. Now, let's dive in. Let's build it better. Alex, amazing name. Welcome to Builders.
Thanks for having me. And yeah, the best podcast host name I've been a part of yet, I think.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to have you with us today. You are a performance psychologist and an advisor to professional sports teams. So anyone who's listened to this knows I love a sports analogy, knows that I think there's a massive connection between athletes and successful leaders. So we are going to have so much fun. But as always, I'm not even going to try to do you justice in introducing all of the things that you are. So if, in your own words, if you could tell us, who are you and what are you building?
Well, thank you for the opportunity and thanks for having me. So I'm Alex Auerbach. I'm a performance psychologist by training. So I have a PhD in counseling psychology and basically a double major in sport and performance psychology. So I'm trained as a clinician, first and foremost, to treat the full spectrum of mental health concerns, ranging from more clinical issues like anxiety and depression all the way to like peak performance issues. And that's where I spend most of my time now. And I've got my hand in several different things. So I'm a consulting psychologist for the Jacksonville Jaguars. We just wrapped up our season, had a pretty good year, which was a ton of fun. I'm advising a WNBA team in Toronto called the Toronto Tempo, which is essentially advising a startup in the sports world, which we could get into some if you'd like. It's a pretty unique opportunity to be involved in. I run my own business as an executive coach and performance coach where I work with founders, entrepreneurs, executives, folks in venture capital, private equity, musicians. And then I run a business called Momentum Labs where we're trying to scale what I do in professional sports to youth athletes with the idea that if we could help young athletes think, feel, and perform better in their sport, it could be a great vehicle for ultimately, hopefully, staving off some of the emerging youth mental health crisis we have and create a healthier sport environment for everyone. So those are the few things that I'm working on outside of work. I have 2 little girls that I love to spend time with, and you can probably see them over my shoulder over here, but the dog is just hanging out. So I spend a lot of my time outside and with the people I love.
I love that. My goodness, so many places I want to go in just that overview. Before we jump too far in, I always love to bring people who are building things, right? How we ended up with Builders as the name of this. So was there a moment where you knew that you were meant to, build businesses, build teams, build sports performance? Like, I think there's so much interconnection there.
I can't say that there was a specific moment where I knew. I think there were probably more moments where I realized I shouldn't be doing something, more like rule out than rule in moments, but moments where, it just wasn't super resonant for me, whether it was, part of what I did in graduate school, like working in a, behavioral health clinic, like great experience to work with what student athletes will call NARPs, like non-athletic regular people, great experience, but not super mission aligned, vision aligned for me. And then I think as I got out of my first job in professional sports, I did get really into sort of like where could I compete, and really where could I compete with myself? A big part of my identity and what I enjoy it is competing. It's a big part of why I like being in sports, is just the opportunity to go against somebody else in some way and sort of see how you stack up, and then doing it again the following night or the following week or whatever it is, depending on the sport. And I think business presents a really cool opportunity to really do that with myself. Like, can I beat, 2025 Alex? Can I do a better job with, the way I run things, or how focused I am, or the way that I, monetize what I do, and trying to use that as a vehicle for self-improvement, which I think, for me personally is highly motivating. Like, if I can, one of the things I'm working on this year, for example, is trying to narrow my focus a little bit so that I could do a better job of like building the things that I'm working on and not get pulled in a million different directions. And does that have a meaningful impact on the work that I'm doing and the things that I'm building? I think will be a cool experiment to run. So for me, I think it's been more of a process of experimentation and elimination than an aha that, this is what I should be doing. But I'm very happy that I experimented my way here.
I love it. You may have got here through a process of elimination, but what you just described tells me that you are a commensurate entrepreneur, the like too many opportunities, not enough focus, or working on ensuring the focus is there to deliver on them. I love that. Let's just get straight into it. Let's talk elite performance. Athletes and entrepreneurs, what's the same? What's different?
Yeah, in my view, there's actually a fair bit that's the same. So it might be easier to start with what's different. I think probably the most significant difference to me is the level of public scrutiny that goes on. Now, obviously, in a business context, you've got investors, and if you IPO, there's a different level. But for most startups and entrepreneurs, no one's writing about you on Twitter, right? No one's talking about you or betting on you. There's no prop bets on the work that you're doing. People aren't booing you or sending DMs to your family if you don't meet your, quarterly earnings calls, right? And in sports, that's very, very different. And I do think is a notable performance impactor that we probably don't spend enough time talking about or thinking about. And I think is going to change. And I think the second element is there is like a real scoreboard, right? I think a lot of times with executives, you have kind of your internal scoreboard, right? You're trying to hit a number that you gave to, your board members, or you're working on reaching, a set amount of annual recurring revenue because that like leads to the next milestone. And to a degree, it's a scoreboard, but it's not the same as, like one team has this many points and one team has this many points, and there's a clear kind of winner and loser. And so I think, that does impact, obviously, human behavior, and, there's social influence and all these other things from psychology that kind of play out in that context that might be slightly less salient in business than they might be in sport. But I think by and large, there are a ton of similarities. So, for one, I think you've got kind of a handful of core things that make for, a great athlete or a great leader or a great executive, I think, and those are pretty consistent across domains. So that's, being a great communicator, being a good team player, being able to perform under pressure, having high quality decision making, knowing how to regulate your emotions, like those skills that help an athlete do their best on the court or on the field are the same skills that help an entrepreneur do their best, in the office. I think there's a similar amount of pressure, and depending on the sport, honestly, like similar kind of time horizons on which that pressure plays out. I think business is a marathon to a degree, but you've got all these little milestones that you're sort of pushing and sprinting to hit. And sports has those same things where, like in the NBA, one of the most interesting things I learned is at about 33% of the season, you can meaningfully predict the outcome for that team, whether they're going to make the playoffs or all those things. And so, you've got these like short increments of time that really matter a lot for the long-term outcome. And I think how you manage that time is obviously really important. And again, I think that's a similarity between the two. Like an NBA season is 82 games long. It's a lot of basketball to play. Running a company is, 5, 10, 15 years, right? But the short, meaningful sprints and how you manage that, I think, is also pretty important and quite similar. And then I think probably the things that tank an entrepreneur or lead to failure are the same things that lead to failure in sports, right? So, difficulty with teammates, conflict, bad decision making, unclear values, difficulty adjusting or managing change, lack of role clarity and role definition, competing goals and conflicting interests. All those things kind of play out in both contexts in a similar way.
That you and I have talked in the past. I call it like internal locus of control. I think you called it high agency. How does that kind of factor into success?
I mean, you're dead on. It's essentially the same concept, but different language, right? And internal locus of control or agency just really means it's about the idea that you take ownership or feel a sense of accountability and responsibility to the outcomes that you deliver. And I personally believe that that's really important. I think it matters a lot for the way that we show up in the world. I think it matters for how we work with other people, how we communicate, the way that we handle conflict, the way that we handle failure, the way that we handle success. But I don't know that alone would be the thing that sort of like separates good from great. I think there are probably a few things that matter, and certainly that's one of them. I think the best athletes I've been around and the best entrepreneurs I've been around have this sort of, to quote Jocko Willink for a second, like this kind of extreme ownership mindset. Like everything that happens here is I'm responsible for, and you've got to be really careful that doesn't sort of extend into unnecessary self-blame or self-criticism, but the belief that like you can have a meaningful impact on the outcome, I think is really, really important. And there's some cultural nuances there and, different things that people might like lean on that, encourage or maybe like alter the way that agency is expressed. I don't know if it minimizes it, but like, for example, if you're a more religious person and God plays a significant role in the way that you think about what happens in your life, like that doesn't necessarily make you lower agency, but the way that high agency manifests might look a little different than someone who's like an atheist, for example, right? But by and large, like that construct, I think is super important for people who are ultimately trying to be their best when it matters most. I think you've got to have a sense of the ability to deliver at all in those contexts for you to feel like you can even be your best in the first place.
How does that kind of play out in, entrepreneurial leaders and athletic leaders? Because I know for me, I often talk about, being the best version of you, because you set the scene, you set the tone, you set the culture, trickle down. And that, I talk about that in so many different ways with my clients, depending on the context. But I'd love to hear from your perspective that, ownership, agency, taking responsibility. Is there ways that you've seen that play out that you think really can make the difference in those who can get to the next level and those who maybe stay a little bit like stagnant and stuck?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big kind of link here and sort of like the missing piece is this concept of self-regulation, right? So what that really means is the ability to kind of control and direct your thinking, feeling, physiology, and as a result, your learning and behavior, right? So if you can do a good job of staying composed, basically, if you can do a good job of being clear in your thinking, if you can do a good job of understanding your motivation, your needs, your drivers, and then you can link that to that high agency, you can link that to that sense of control, I think what you're gonna find is really, really high quality people. And a great example in sports came up this last weekend. I don't know how much NFL playoffs you watched, but poor Josh Allen, man, just an incredible player, has a really tough break in a playoff game and gets up on the podium crying and is, I let my teammates down. And football is the ultimate team game. It requires all, in some cases, 33, if you count special teams, players, right, give or take, like doing their part and delivering. But in sports, you see a lot of this kind of high agency and this self-regulation in the post-game press conferences, right? It's on me. It's my responsibility. I could have done better. Here's how I'm going to show up next time. Here are the changes I'm committed to making. And I think in executives, you see it very similarly. It's, I'm responsible for the outcome of my team. I don't pass the blame or cast blame somewhere else. I believe that my impact on my company or where I show up really matters, and I respect my time enough to know where to show up and how to show up in a way that's impactful. And I think you see those same things in sports. So I think you got to pair those two concepts to really get to that super elite level, right? It's this like I am in total control of myself, basically. And as a result, I believe I have control and can exert my will over the world. And if you have those two things, you can end up with really, really high level performance over time. And, we can get into this more, sort of like how does that actually play out? But I think, a big part of sustaining that performance over time then is having enough awareness of when you need to recover, when you need to push harder. And all that is born from having really clear understanding of yourself and self-regulation and knowing how to do those things so that you can ramp up and ramp down and kind of exert your will meaningfully.
Yeah, you just made me think about actually one of the things that started this podcast that was never meant to be a podcast, which I have a really firm belief that like stagnation is one of the ultimate killers for performance, for progress, for growth. And I think when what you're describing leads to action, right? It's like there's no despair. Despair leads to stagnation, right? Like, I don't know what I could do. And it's like, well, even if you don't know, the archetype you just described is like, okay, well, who can help me figure that out? Great. So then the action is to get in touch with that person. And then from there, define it. And so really hearing like ownership and control, but just so that there's always an action and like everything compounds, right? That's a big belief for me. So if it's owning it and saying what you're going to do next, or knowing, like people are always like, yeah, but this person on my team. I'm like, cool. Well, you either hired them or didn't fire them. So it's still down to you, right?
Yeah, no doubt.
I think back to my athletic career, and I had a lot of excitement, and I definitely had the like, it's all my fault. It has been reflected to me that there were moments where I was sort of crumbling from taking on full responsibility for things maybe beyond my control at a younger age. But I don't remember nerves. I remember excitement. I remember focus. And I have since read a lot on performance, and there's a lot of studies, and you can probably clarify this much better than I can, about the areas of the brain that light up when someone is excited versus nervous. When an athlete is excited, the same areas of the brain might be lighting up as someone else who's feeling nerves. And this idea that it's really a translation. And I think that applies also to entrepreneurship, because sitting in fear, again, is like really unhelpful, but the things you have to do are often things you've never done in a semi-public forum. And they require you to have more excitement than fear. How is that something you've seen? The kind of two kinds of nerves?
Yeah, there's so much to unpack here. So if it's okay, can I go on a little rabbit hole here? So, I want to start with where you started around this concept of stagnation, because I think one of the things that's really interesting about the development of elite skill, I don't know if you've read Adam Grant's book, Hidden Potential. He kind of references this famous paper called Plateaus, Dips, and Leaps. And the idea is, I think, what really resonates for me about what you're saying is I think people confuse plateaus with stagnation. And I think people also confuse going backwards with the idea that there's like a huge problem, right? So, in sports, there's a great paper called the Mundanity of Excellence. And it talks about what separates Olympic swimmers from, they call them class 2A, 3A, 4A. And what we all think, and what happens for sure a lot in the business world, is time, right? We think, if you just spend more time in the pool, you're going to get to that Olympic level. But time actually leads to stagnation in many cases, right? What actually helps people move from 4A to 3A to 2A to Olympic is the same thing that helps people make what the authors of the Plateaus, Dips, and Leaps paper called league stepping adjustments to their performance is wide experimentation, refining of that performance skill, and then the implementation of that skill over time. And so, I bring that up just to say, I think when people are feeling stagnant, what I try to often encourage is more experimenting, because there is always more that you can be doing. And I think despair, as you mentioned, emotion to me is just information, right? And so can we take that information and can we do something with it? I think you're dead on with the role that action plays in changing the outcomes that we have. And I think that's a hugely important insight, but that's coming from a trained behaviorist. So, take that for what it's worth. Not everyone would agree with me, but, I think that there's a lot in there around like how you move through these periods where you feel stuck. And I think oftentimes the default is to do more, like more volume, more hours. 996 is making a comeback, right? Like, and don't get me started on that, but like, that's a solution, but it may not be the best solution. And often as it pertains to elevating your performance, that sign of despair, that feeling of being stuck, that sign of hopelessness is probably just a sign that whatever strategy you're using so far is probably not going to work at whatever the next level is. And we've got to experiment widely, figure out what that is, and then you'll take a leap forward once you refine enough. So I'll get off that soapbox and I'll get onto your other one here about emotion. But, really what the science shows is that emotion is really just it's a categorization. It's not a problem. It's a categorization, or it's a concept, right? So what ends up happening is, we piece together bits of our history in the present moment based on what's coming in, from the sensory world around us. And then we have this internal physiological response to things, right? So I get on this podcast with you and I've done, 100 podcasts. And, now I feel a little bit more calm when I get on a podcast. But at the beginning, I was super nervous. And so what would happen is I'd have, past experiences where I felt nervous, right? I labeled it, the emotion, the concept, nervous. And then I felt those same things and I looked around at what was happening in my world and I go, gosh, I'm in a pressure packed situation, and these feelings in this situation I call nervousness, right? But what happens is we have a ton of control over what we call things. And so there's some really interesting research around the idea of challenge versus threat, which is kind of nervousness versus excitement, or what you're talking about is how people frame the physiology of stress, which comes from a really cool line of research by a woman named Kelly McGonigal. She wrote a book called The Upside of Stress, if you're really interested in this for those listening. But the basic principle is the same. Like, you can choose what concept or category you place your emotion in. And the concept or category you choose does have cascading effects back down your nervous system in ways that can help you either use that energy or emotion more effectively, or it can be debilitating. So let's take your example of nervousness and excitement. What really happens when we feel either nervous or excited is you get, the basic physiological things. Your heart rate increases, you get sweaty palms, maybe you get a sweaty brow, your speech rate increases, your eyes dilate a little bit, right? Like, you get into this space and you have all these physiological markers of energy. That's it. Like, there's really nothing more than that at that point. And then you decide, like, is this a time where I should feel nervous, right? I feel threatened. I feel like there's a problem, or do I feel excited? And if you frame it as excitement, what you're going to get is all that physiology. I've heard it described by a good friend of mine who's also an incredible neuroscientist, Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, is like getting your butterflies flying in formation. That's what happens when you label something excitement, right? You're sort of taking all that energy that's come up physiologically and you're channeling it in a really goal-directed way that's more positive, that's more expansive, that helps you see opportunity. If you turn it into nervousness, what you're turning it into is something that narrows your focus a little bit. Those internal signals become like maybe more barriers to peak performance. Now, it doesn't mean you can't overcome it. It doesn't mean the nervousness won't go away. Like, there's lots of other layers to it. But a big part of this process is really choosing at the outset whether the experience you have is something you see as a sign that you care, or a sign that you're determined, or a sign that you're challenged, or a sign that there's an opportunity here, or whether you see it as like, oh my gosh, this is a chance I screwed up, or people are going to judge me, or this isn't going to go well, or if I fail at this podcast, I'm going to lose my whole business, right? Those two sort of divergent streams of thinking will tell you a lot about subsequent performance.
I love that. I love the practical, like, when this activation comes up, how do I label it? Love that. For anyone who's listening, I think that is really powerful. And actually, the second part that you said really resonated, because I think back to when I was an athlete, I was thinking about the challenge. I was thinking about, like, I can't wait to get out and execute this plan. I can't wait to attack that and, do what I've trained for. And then I think about things where maybe now, just in life, when I get that nervous heart rate. And it is usually more of a fear of loss, like, or a fear of the unknown, and often things that tap into our evolution, right? So like if we're worried about, getting kicked out of a group, or we're worried about losing resources, and actually sometimes like the more you have to lose, right? So I think that's such an interesting distinction that could be really helpful if someone's sitting there being like, okay, but like how do I do this?
Yeah, and I can give you a little more if you want on that, but I
Yeah.
sort of mentioned them at the end. But um, if it's okay, I'll kind of frame the whole thing up. I don't want to ramble too much, so cut me off if you feel like I'm going too deep here. But
I'm here
at the
for it.
outset, right, we have this stress response, and I think honestly, a lot of the problems people have start from there because we've all been socialized into this idea that stress is bad, right? Like, oh, stress is harmful. I grew up, I think you did too. I think we're of similar age, like in this era where people were saying like, oh, stress is the new smoking. If you stress, it's going to kill you. Like chronic stress is the worst. And like, there's nuance to it, right? Chronic stress with no recovery over time is bad. It will hurt you. But stress on its own is not bad. Stress with recovery leads to progress. Like that's how muscle is built. That's how learning happens. But stress, we need stress. Like if you don't have any stress, you will die. And if you have too much stress, you will die. It follows like a principle of hormesis. But stress at its core is just your brain and body preparing you to do something effortful. So people have made this big deal about cortisol, but cortisol is not really a stress hormone. Cortisol is an energy hormone. Like when you wake up in the morning, you get a shot of cortisol. That cortisol is to get you out of bed. It's not because you're stressed getting out of bed. It's not hard to get out of bed for most people. Like it's
For
just
yourself.
energy. Yeah, well, I love getting out of bed, but it's just energy. It's just activation getting you ready, right? But because most of us have been socialized into this idea that stress is really problematic, we all kind of default naturally without really working on it to this idea that stress is harmful. Stress is a threat, right? And so what happens is when we feel stressed, for most people, the first thing that goes on is, oh crap, here we go again. This is bad for me. This is a problem. But there is a lot that you can do to sort of change that. And where that comes from is this really cool line of research done with some Navy SEALs around what they call stress as enhancing mindset. And it turns out that if you want to see stress as something useful, it's kind of like 4 ways you can think about stress to kind of tap in to stress as being something more useful. So the first is seeing a stressor, right? Seeing whatever this thing is as a challenge, right? Like this is a chance to show what I'm made of. This is a challenge to compete with the best players in the world. This is a chance to see if I can build something just as incredible as the next person, So that's one. The second is to see it as an opportunity, right? It's a chance to show what I'm made of. It's an opportunity to learn something new. It's a chance to have a great experience in the world. Third is to see it as energy that's assigned you're determined, right? Like, gosh, my body must really think that I need this to get this done, and I'm going to use this to like drive to the finish line. And then fourth is a sign you care. So most people don't have a stress response to things that aren't important to them in some way. Now, it might be confusing to you as to why you care about it, but in the moment, we don't really need to unpack that for performance, right? So sometimes people will feel like a stress response, and they're having a conflict with someone that they like maybe think that they don't care about. Well, it's like, we don't need to understand whether or not you do actually care about this person in the moment of performance. What we need to understand is your body is sending you a signal that this matters. And so you can choose to use that in a way that's more helpful. So I think tactically, starting to think about which of those 4 framings resonates most for you, which can you leverage most under pressure, those things will help you respond better when you're feeling a bit under the gun.
This might be like older research, but is this the same concept as eustress and de-stress?
It's very similar, yeah. So, I mean, distress is what comes if you associate it with a threat, right? Is distress. Eustress comes from this kind of challenge framing. But yeah, I mean, it's complicated. There's no like good or bad necessarily. It's sort of like, I think it was a Shakespeare line, like there's neither good nor bad, but something makes it so. This is kind of the same thing, right? Like stress is neither good or bad, but thinking makes it so kind of deal. Like how you choose to frame it does make a big difference. But yes, it's a very similar concept.
So you are doing a number of businesses, right? We've just dived into the psychology side of it, which it's very hard to pull myself out of. I would love to keep going on that, but I'm curious, you are in a number of businesses. How do they tie together? Like, why these businesses? Why now? Is this your whole kind of evolution has brought you here? Is it you saw an opportunity and clearly in the market?
Yeah, I think probably a bit of both, right? So how do they fit together? Like at its core, what a psychologist does is just examine and try to understand human behavior, which is a pretty broad thing that you could apply. So then I sort of follow like where am I most passionate, right? What behavior am I most interested in understanding? And like any good psychologist, a lot of it started with myself. We psychologists or psychiatrists like get into their work because they're really curious about their own growth, development, history, whatever. Mine was, I made Olympic development soccer when I was fairly young, but I was not that athletic of a kid. I was probably like average athletic. I was maybe a little taller and stronger than some folks, but like slower. So it all sort of balanced out. But at a very, very young age, I had people tell me that what made me a good soccer player was the way I saw the field and the way I processed the game. And so for me, there's always been this real interest in like, is that true? Did I really see the field differently, or was it something else? And I actually think it's a combination. I think I do see things differently. I do have really good spatial skills. I think I did process the game more efficiently than some other people. I also think I just have a much higher tolerance of pain than a lot of people. And so I think I'm willing to work in ways that most people are not, and I'm capable of working for a lot longer than most people are. That doesn't mean I should do that, but I think I figured that out at like a fairly young age. And so I got very curious about sort of like the limits of things, like where does this become a problem? Where does this facilitate excellence? How do I maximize this part of myself to become the best that I can be? How do I live a life that's meaningful and maximized, which I think is like complicated and sometimes people think is conflicting. So those were things I was like really interested in exploring. And then I happened to be, when I moved in high school, I moved from Arizona to Rhode Island, and I kind of stopped playing sports, and I got really interested in coaching because, for all these things I mentioned before, like I like competing. I'm, really interested in the pursuit of excellence and those kinds of things. And so, I fairly early in my career, like at 19, got exposed to pro sports, and that just became like the environment that I wanted to be in. So, you kind of pair those two things as like interest in human limits and human potential with an environment that sort of exploring that all the time. And that was how I ended up in its simplest form in working in pro sports. And then the businesses are kind of offshoots of that, right? So one of the things that I noticed is, and that happens all the time still is, and I think this is how a lot of good businesses start, honestly, is like people just email me asking questions, right? Like, hey, I'm a local mom. My daughter swims at the high school up the road, and there's nobody here that can work with her, and she's struggling with confidence. Can you help? And it's like, I can't really. Like, I could in theory, but I can't because you're going to be really frustrated because I don't really have time for Susie the swimmer. Like, not that I don't want to help, but like, I'm going to have to cancel every other appointment because I have to get on a plane to fly to Florida. Like these things are hard. But that happened, 6, 7, 8 times a week with people looking for stuff. And I was like, gosh, there has to be a better way to do this than just send an email to the person you find on the internet and hope that they're available, right? And so that was the first thing I set out to sort of discover was like, could we build a solution to that? And I partnered with a couple other, colleagues and friends who I really respect to start to build that out and think about ways that we could bring that service to youth athletes. And Momentum Labs was born as a result of that, right? Can we give youth athletes these skills, and can we help parents access these services in a much easier way? And we're still experimenting and iterating and trying to figure out the best way to do that. But I think it was born out of a real need, which is just a natural extension of the work I already do. And like happens in the entrepreneurial world, pro sports is sort of like the mecca of sport, right? It's what everyone's working toward. And so, young athletes and college athletes look to that and they assume like, oh, credibility, that person must be good. That person knows what it takes. I think that same thing happens in business, right? Where a previously exited founder is, super sought after because they know what it takes, right? And so it's a really natural kind of extension of the work that I do. The other thing that I'm working on now is figuring out how I take the work that I do in the NBA or NFL draft, where I'm creating psychological profiles of, in some instances, like 3 prospects we're deciding between, in some instances, 300 prospects we're deciding between, and help companies leverage that same data to make better hiring decisions. I think I'd be really curious what you think about this, but my hypothesis is that most company hires don't fail because the person truly lacks like the technical ability to do whatever they hired for. Most of the time, the failure is a fit issue. And fit could be a lot of things. It could be mismatched personality. It could be mismatched values. It could be mismatched boss and subordinate. But ultimately, these are things that we tend to not really screen for in interviews, right? We show up and, it's like, oh, I like you. You seem like me, right? This is what's happening in the first 10 seconds of an interview. And then we spend the rest of that interview trying to confirm all the things that we already believe about this person. And there's plenty of data to back this up, which is a very bad way to get to a good outcome. And sports has, as a result, invested millions of dollars to try to basically prevent that from happening. So sports does things like separate out talent evaluation from decision maker. In most jobs, you've got one person who's basically playing head coach, hiring committee, and general manager, like head coach, scout, general manager. I found the talent and I think the talent's good. Now I'm going to coach and develop the talent and I'm going to hire the talent all in one person. But in pro sports, those things are very disparate. Like when I was in Toronto, we were very careful about what input we took from where, because everyone's got bias that's playing into this decision, and it really does impact what happens. And so if there are ways we can figure out to take that same model and bring it into business, I think we can do a really good job of, one, helping people find places that are better to work for themselves, which I think is a huge part. And there's really good data around person environment fit at work and what leads to people feeling fulfilled. And second, obviously, help companies do a better job, because the negative impact of hiring someone that is not a good culture fit is much more than financial. There's some like really interesting data about how, underperformers impact other people, how they undermine the culture, the long-term effects of that. And so if we can eliminate that, we can also make the work experience better for the people who stick around.
Yes to all of that. Absolutely. I actually think we probably do like a micro podcast just on that specific area. But I want to keep talking a little bit about kind of your journey and your leadership, and we'll probably come back to some of this because I always want to have the tactical too. But how has, as from someone else who started in athletics and then still very much relates a lot of what I do in business to it, how has your leadership journey evolved? Like, what have been some of the biggest influences and inflections and pivots that determined like how you manage your teams, your business partnerships today?
I think it probably is a combination of like long distance observing and lived experience, right? So, I think early in my career when I was young, just getting into coaching, this was sort of peak Nick Saban, Urban Meyer. And we've sort of seen how that's played out in several ways. But like, those were people who I'm like, oh, I wonder how they do what they do, And so I studied a lot and I learned, like, just tried to learn a lot. What are the things that Nick Saban is instilling in his team that gets the results that he gets? What are the things Urban Meyer is doing in his team that gets the results that he gets? And then as I got older, I sort of saw what about those things was good, what about those things was extremely problematic, and what I wanted to like keep, cut, stop, start, keep kind of thing from looking at that. So I think that was the very early part, and I've honestly always been sort of interested in like crafting my own philosophies about things. So from a pretty early age, I started to just think about like, if I were a leader, what would I do? And I actually I can send it to you, but I have a document I wrote that's like my leadership style. And it answers a lot of these questions, like who does influence my leadership? And it's, some of it is like thinkers like Daniel Kahneman, and some of it is people like Barack Obama, and so I'm sort of a hodgepodge, but I've been doing that for a fair bit of time. And then I think as I got older and more experienced professionally, and started to work at higher levels in teams than being an intern, I started to really pay attention to both what the leader did, but also what the impact was on the people around them. I think I've naturally been pretty curious about like our human existence. And I do think we spend, a third of our lives at work basically. And so, if that experience is good or bad is really pretty important. And so I had some experiences early professionally where, I had a really good relationship with the leader, but the people that were around me really didn't like them. And I'm like, okay, how do I make sense of that? What is it that they don't like? And so I just kept sort of like thinking about it, and wrestling with some of those questions. And then I got really lucky. I had a great boss in my first role as a sports psychologist who really pushed me. And interestingly, also rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. But I really respected like the level of rigor that he applied to the things he was thinking about and what was really important to him and the way he communicated and how he managed things. And somewhere along the way, I basically realized that I could learn something from pretty much anyone if I took the time to like figure it out. And so I just started applying that too. And then I think, I had a great boss in Toronto, very similar. I saw like, what about his style works? What about his style might not work for me? But I thought he was excellent at managing those things. And so finally, when I went out on my own, I basically thought about like, who are all the people that I looked up to? Because I don't mean this in a bad way, but like, I think I have a pretty high bar, like if I'm going to admire you or think you're good at something, like I think you gotta be really good at something. I don't tend to apply that to most people, which is probably not great, but I do. So then I started to think about like, what is it that I admire, and are there parts of that I could replicate? And then paired that with what's the experience I want the people around me to have. And I don't by any stretch do it perfectly or sometimes even well at all. But I think probably the central feature of my leadership is that I'm pretty constantly thinking about how will this thing that I'm about to do or this behavior I'm about to engage in, how will that impact the people around me? And will that lead them to be more or less likely to follow me? And will that lead them to be more or less likely to do what they need to do in a way that facilitates good outcomes? And I think that as a guiding principle will probably stick around for a fair bit of time.
I love what you just described is like almost like experience design, and very much aligns to something that I often think about, which is I really think, incredible leaders are built, not born. And it's the ability to, I guess, define and develop via observation and emulation the leader that you want to be. And I would love to see that document that you mentioned. I think about how I came to my leadership, so I'm super curious whether it would align, and you can divulge or not. But I think about servant leadership is very much my style, right? Like the team's win is my win. My whole job is to make sure everyone else is winning, and that includes hiring and firing and everything. And ultimately, if everyone knows where they need to be and what they need to do and has the skill or the instructions or the tools to do it, then we should win. And then they win, then I win. And for me, I know that comes from sports. Like I know that I never even thought about it until I was fairly late into my leadership career, sort of around the time I started this business. Like I never even really thought about it. It just is how I operated. But I think you learn that in such a tangible way in sports, right? It's like whether you're the captain or not, when a new person shows up, you're like, hey, do you need, this is what you need to know. And then when you are the captain or the coach or a key leader on the team, you're like, hey, you got to be there because of this to do that, right? And like it's such a tangible nature in sports that is not. I don't think everyone sees it the same way in business, but for me, it's really a one-for-one.
I think that's right. And I think, I'm just putting this together now as I'm listening to you, but I would imagine like sports may be the only place that you really learn that as a kid. I guess I could imagine like band or orchestra maybe, but like speech and debate, probably not. Chess club, probably not. Running for school president, probably not. And so there just are some really good lessons that come out of being in a sport environment in ways that I think do facilitate mastering that style of leadership. And I think the best coaches are instilling this idea that like, we above me essentially, right? Or team above me kind of concept that I think underpins a lot of what servant leadership is about. And there have been times that I've struggled with servant leadership as a concept. And I think it's probably been like abused a bit as a term. But, I think there's some really good principles in there. And I do think it leads to environments where people feel more included, feel more valued, feel more cared for, because it's a shared accomplishment and it's a shared sense of responsibility.
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot too, because I speak about, when you've mentioned this emotional regulation, being solutions oriented, right? So it's like, you can't freak out when a problem comes in. You've got to be solutions oriented if you want your team to be, if you want them to collaborate, if you want them to move fast. Fast happens in the absence of volatility, right? Or happens easier in the absence of volatility. And I don't know that I have like a fully formed perspective on it, but I think there's these interesting intersections that I've observed and have over time, right? Like figuring out in our roles, often it's like, how do you say the thing without someone understanding your 25 years of, athletic and professional expertise? You're like, I need to communicate this in 2 sentences or less.
Yeah. Yeah. What you're describing, have you heard the Navy SEAL saying that slow is smooth, smooth is fast, fast is lethal? That's sort of what
I leverage that.
Yeah, that's what you're describing to me. And I think that's super resonant for sure.
Yeah. You mentioned meaningful and maximized, and I always love to ask about what I call in our branded version wealthy leadership, which is really just success on your terms, right? Like, what does success actually mean for you? What do you want out of life? So what does meaningful and maximized mean? Is that how you would define success? What does that look like today versus 10 years ago?
Yeah, I'll try to reverse engineer it a little bit for you. So I guess today success is probably meaningful and maximal are around my core values, right? So meaningful for me is like, is this activity aligned with something I care about, which is typically like excellence, love, or joy. Those are the 3 things that I'm like kind of constantly thinking about. And if I don't feel like what I'm about to do is going to bring me closer to that in some dimension, then I probably shouldn't do it, And so I think meaningful really centers around, do I have enough of those things in my life in a consistent enough basis where I feel like I'm getting the chance to live sort of the fullest expression of what I care about. And then maximal, I think, is really about like, can I do those things as well as possible, as consistently as possible? And so, yeah, I guess success is sort of a combination of the two. But I think oftentimes like, people conflate meaning with like, I was a family man or I wasn't a family man, or I had good relationships or I didn't have good relationships. And like, there's definitely part of that, but sometimes meaning is also about your own personal journey, and it's about the things that you do along the way. And of course, people matter in that, but like it doesn't have to only be defined by how much you worked or didn't work, which is how I think it typically gets boiled down to, right? And I think this happens a lot for founders, where it's like, it was only meaningful if I had a 7, 8, 9-figure exit. It's like, well, that's a hard way to live. That's a very hard way to define meaning. And I think maximal, you could maybe define by those outcomes, but I think you'd be better off, focusing on the amount that you learned or how well you applied the things that you were doing. I think, historically, I probably equated success more with financial outcomes and sort of like comparative metrics, I would say, like, am I better than someone at this thing? I think as I've gotten older, and I think especially being in pro sports, you see, like, football is such a great example. You see how different elite can look based on different skills, right? So like offensive linemen walk into the room, and if you just like looked at them, if you walked past them in a grocery store, most people would not be like, oh, that's an NFL player, and this person is one of the top, 500 people in the world at what they do, right? You would just sort of like think they were an average guy that happened to be a little tall, and on the flip side, if you saw like a wide receiver or a famous quarterback, you'd kind of know, right? But like neither position is any more or less elite than the other. It's just the way that it manifests is completely different, and the skills required to be great at it are completely different. And so I think as I've gotten older and seeing more of that stuff, it's like, well, my version of great doesn't really have anything to do with what other people are doing. It has to do with like my own sense of, am I aligned with those three things? Am I doing that well? Am I doing it consistently? If I'm not, can I adjust? And I think I'm really oriented around maximizing those three things to get to the most meaningful, best life I can.
I very much resonate with what you described. And in general, I think that's so core when we start to recognize that how things manifest in the world versus what they mean to us, all of that like can be very different, that there are iterations, and how sports can teach you that. A little bit of a different, but when you were mentioning it, made me think. I talk about rugby, which was one of the two sports that I excelled in, and how I think sports are so fundamental. We already just talked about it's, one of the only places you learn certain skill sets as a kid. I think they're fundamental to kids. I think I was very lucky, like you said, we're of similar age, to grow up before, social media. We had media, but social media is a whole other kettle of fish. And I was a huge tomboy, and I played these very physical sports, and I existed in different farm environment and sport environment. And I felt like rugby for everyone, but particularly for girls, was this really interesting place, because there are a lot of sports where there's one physicality, there's one kind of body type that is typical. And rugby was so interesting to me because you needed a whole set of different physiques, let alone mentalities and whatever, but different physiques to have a good team. And I thought that was so interesting because it really was one of the many places where I learned to focus on what my body could do, and the strength and the skills and the execution. And I feel like it really helped me not get as exposed or influenced by the media. And I was also very not feminine for a long time, so that's a whole other conversation. But I think what you're describing again is why I just think athletics and maybe creativity, because I know not everybody loves athletics, but for children growing up, I just think exposure to those two areas allows your mind to form concepts in different ways. I'm not articulating this as well as I would love to, but I think it's so interesting. And I really liked how you described was meaningful and maximal.
I appreciate that. And I think you're explaining yourself quite well. And I'm with you. And, sports is not the end all be all for everyone, but I do think like creative endeavors or, so music, art, or even other things where you kind of need to think for yourself and rely on other people, right? Like Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, those things can also teach you some of these kind of important lessons where you just develop a different sense of what it means to be living in a way that works for you.
Do you have a take on kind of having it all? Because that's something when I ask people about success, and trade-offs. Trade-offs is a part of almost everything, business, personal. There's, the pursuit of one thing, saying yes to something means saying no to something else. Do you have a perspective from your journey through leadership as someone who is, I would say multi-potentialite, multi-hyphenate, running multiple businesses? Do you have a take on that? Can you have it all? Is it yes, but not at the same time?
I do have a take. I don't know how well articulated it will be, but I'll try to unpack it. I'm actually working right now on a new book. I wrote a book last year that came out. I'm working on a new book called Do It All Dads is the working title. And, the basic premise is yes, I do think you can. And I think that by and large, it's written for dads because I'm a dad, but I think it applies probably to everybody. I think by and large, we've been sold this sort of message that you really can't have it all. I think it depends on what it all is, but I think it is possible, if you think of your life as a series of domains, right? Like work, family, health, sleep, friendship, I do think you can have all of those things. What I don't think you can have is all of those things in equal increments. And I don't think you can have all of those things at the same velocity at the same time or same intensity at the same time necessarily. And I think that from my own experience, what I'm finding is, prioritizing parenting does just mean less time for work. And so that requires a different way of working, right? Whether that's like waking up at 4 a.m. and working until 5:30 and then going to the gym and then seeing my kids and, doing all that stuff. Like that's what I'm doing right now, but so some people would say that's a sacrifice. Some people wouldn't. Like, I don't know if that's a sacrifice or not. What I can say is it's a trade-off, right? It's a trade-off between, more sleep or not. And, I think all those things matter. So I guess if I were to summarize quickly, I think, yes, you can have it all. I don't think you can have it all in equal increments. Like, I don't think you're going to get 8 hours of work and 8 hours of family time and 8 hours of sleep and think that that is good. I don't think that's going to be the solution. But I do think you can have the things that you want to have. It does require pretty ruthless prioritization. It does require pretty intensive discipline, I think, to do it. And the more I've thought about it, the more I think where this idea that you can't have it all comes from probably the general idea that most people don't have the discipline to execute all the things that they want to execute to have it all. It is very hard, but I think it's totally possible. But I could turn out to be wrong. And then I think there's obviously variance in that, right? So like if you're a pro athlete, for example, like your window to be a pro athlete is pretty small. So you are going to be disproportionately unbalanced, unequal, not prioritizing some things at that point if you really want to be the best that you can be. And I think we often find that the best athletes of all time are choosing that path. You hear about Kobe Bryant and his kind of maniacal workouts. People don't talk as much about how like Kobe took naps, but we can get into that. Like the basic idea was like he worked a lot, right? And he worked a lot on his craft, and that did come at the expense of some other things. And that was a trade-off he made, knowing that in the future that was not even it wasn't even be an option to consider. And I think some of that is similar for founders. Like you may not have the same timeline. You may not have the same opportunity again. You may be running a business that has a real opportunity to have the outcome you want. And that may require a kind of different level of focus and imbalance in some places. But I don't think that means you can't have it all. I think it means you've got to be really intentional about the way that you design things. And you probably have to work through some of your own kind of limiting beliefs around that to get to that point.
I think that's an excellent summary. It struck me earlier when you were saying that the Toronto Tempo is like a startup in the sports world. So how is that like unique? What is it that you guys are doing? What are you learning through that experience? Because you work with startups and you work with sports teams. So you've got both parts of the equation, but
yeah, it's a super neat experience because it's, we're working on things like building a practice facility and starting a team and hiring a team. And you've got, a business operation and you've got a basketball operation, and those things have to sync up, and you're making decisions about branding, and you're making decisions about messaging, and the team's making decisions about how big, a sign should be, right? Like there's all these things that we just kind of take for granted as fans now, especially if you're like a fan of a team that's been around 30 years and the logo is the same, right? Like the process that went into designing the Tempo logo, for example, and sourcing ideas from fans and all that stuff, like it's really neat to see. And I think it's a really interesting startup to be a part of because the size and scale of it from the outset is much bigger than most startups will ever end up being. Like you're coming in with basically a bunch of private money that can kind of do whatever you need to do. But now you've got to work on real estate, and you've got to work on talent acquisition, and you've got to work on culture, and you've got to work on process. And I think for me, what's been most interesting is just seeing how the sort of same kind of challenges that happen in a normal startup play out in this pretty unique context, right? Like still difficulties in building the team, and there's still difficulties in negotiations, and there's difficulties in figuring out the right way to do things and getting everyone up to speed, but you're doing it at this velocity where you have like a clear endpoint because we're going to, hopefully play basketball in 3 months. So it's like the startup has this defined point at which it is no longer, you cannot, I mean, you'll still be a startup, right? But like, you can't operate that way, right? Like, you got to put a product on the floor the same way you got to launch your product like an MVP, but this can't be an MVP. Like, we got to compete for a championship. So it's a unique environment to be a part of. But I think a lot of the same things kind of apply. Like, can you move as quickly as you can without making mistakes? Can you build a good team? Can you create a good culture? Can you select the right talent? Can you put the right leaders in place? Can you get parts of the organization aligned and coordinating on goals effectively? Can you help people understand their role and how it contributes to the bigger picture? All those things go into making it successful.
Oh, that sounds so exciting. And to your point, unique in that you aren't just like, oh, traction, MVP, like first few customers, feedback. It's like, no, we're inserting ourselves into a global arena or a forum that requires XYZ. Like, there is no, like, you're in or you're out, right? And then you perform or you don't, which, to your point earlier about the stage on which you operate as an athlete or a pro team versus entrepreneurs, like, you do get a bit more cover as an entrepreneur up to a certain point.
We do. Yes, we do, for sure. But, I mean, and in the worst case scenarios, sometimes you don't, and so it's a fine line.
So I was thinking about our audience, and, I'm sure many people like me are resonating with the sports and loving it and very curious. And I'm sure there's lots of questions I could ask, and probably some that you might not even be able to answer. But I always want to make sure that there's something that, the builders who are listening, whether they're ready to take their company to the next stage or they're sitting on an idea and figuring out how to make it happen, that they can have something that tomorrow morning they talk to their team or they, talk to their spouse about. And I want to start by going back to the hiring traps. Like, you mentioned that there is quite a low success rate for executive hiring, and that partly that's because we don't delineate the roles the way that sports teams do, because the bias compounds, to your point, right? So, like, I feel this way, and because I made that decision, that feeling then translates into every other stage of the process. How do you get around that, maybe in general, and then if you are in the build phase where you don't have an entire organization that you can delineate across a ton of people, like, what would you recommend people do to try and dampen the bias that comes into the hiring process?
There's lots of things you can do to kind of minimize the bias. And, for anyone listening, like, happy to hop on a call or email and help if I can. But first is, like, it starts by designing a good process, period, right? So a lot of times what happens is, you, Alex, you show up for an interview and I sit down with you and I shake your hand, and right away I judge, like, did you shake my hand well? Are you smiling at me? Do you seem friendly, right? And all those things are influencing how I'm showing up in your interview, right? And then you sit down and I say, so tell me about your life. Where are you from? What's going on? Oh, I saw you worked at this place, 4 years ago. What was that like? Oh, really interesting. Oh, you were employee number 30 at Airbnb. Wow, what was that like? And I'm just all over the place trying to, like, learn about you, right? What that does is I have nothing to compare it to now, right? So this whole interview is relatively low in predictive validity because I'm not actually gathering meaningful information about what I need to be gathering information about. So the first step I would take would be to come up with what are the core competencies for the particular role, and can you design a structured interview around those core competencies, right? So in the NBA or NFL, we know, like, what are the core competencies we want on this team for this position, both from a physical, technical, tactical standpoint, but also from a mental standpoint, right? Like, not everything is the same. If you are a quarterback, what is demanded of you mentally is very different than what is demanded of you if you are a defensive tackle. Doesn't make one more valuable than the other. It just means the competency matrix is different, right? So you want to start by eliminating that first bias, which is just this, like, nonsense hodgepodge, no competency, just deciding if I like you, right? So that's step one, is to build that competency matrix and come up with questions or a structured interview, which basically means I'm going to ask the same questions to the same to all the candidates in the same order with the same follow-ups, so I can make meaningful comparisons between you and this other person. The next thing I would do is look at building what's called the job simulation. And the best predictor of actual job performance is a job simulation or a work sample, right? So if you're hiring a marketing leader, give them a little bit of context and say, come up with a marketing plan or develop a marketing presentation so you can actually see how someone works through the problem and ask questions about those things in live time. Why did you make this choice over that choice? Walk me through what your process looked like to get here. What was the data that you didn't have, but you wished I would have given you? How did you make this assumption? And you're starting to get more into how does a person think? What's the way they're going to solve these problems? And you're sort of evaluating, like, does that match the competency we're looking for in this role? So marketing, for example, we might want someone who's a little more of a nonlinear, divergent, abstract thinker because you want to come up with some kind of creative stuff. And so if they don't demonstrate any of that in that work sample, and that that's a competency you want, you can sort of bump that person down the list, even if you really like how great their handshake was and how nice their smile was at the beginning. You start to bump against some of that. Then the other things you could do would be like leveraging assessments. So, this is something we've talked about offline, but intelligence and some dimensions of personality are also pretty robust predictors of work performance. So measuring intelligence, measuring conscientiousness, and then, extroversion, for example, if you're hiring a salesperson, is a great predictor of sales success, right? Like, are you outgoing and are you, energetic, right? And like, no one wants to get on a sales call with someone who's sort of like boring. So, you need some of that. And so if you can understand those things, right, that'll get you even closer to who's a good candidate. And so as you're collecting all these data points, what you're doing is kind of constantly coming back to this thing we've agreed upon is going to make somebody successful here. And we're coming up with ways to operationalize and measure that, right? So, if you say someone is a creative or divergent thinker, you better have a good example from their interview, like almost word for word that you can point to, right? And here's how you got to that sort of good idea. Then structurally, other things you could do would be have a group of people that's deciding, and Google does this, like bring in an outsider from not the immediate team to sort of provide a perspective on the candidate, right? So someone who doesn't really know like the inner workings or the dynamics or the day-to-day and can just sort of evaluate, like, is this person a culture fit? And making that not a group decision, because I do think at some point like someone has to decide, but a group discussion, right? Like, we're all going to weigh in on this process. I think will also help eliminate some bias. I think the last piece would be kind of separating out, like we talked about, those three roles. So what often happens in corporate is, Alex, you're the VP of marketing at Apple, and your number two leaves. And so you decide that you're posting a job, and you decide who's being interviewed, and you decide who interviews when, and you rank the candidates, and you pick. And that is not going to lead to a very good outcome because you are a human. And so what's going to happen to you is you're going to be influenced by all these things that go on. And I've got a company I'm working with right now where, some of the people on the team are really influenced by things like past education, right? Well, like, for every Harvard MBA educated person that's been a Fortune 500 CEO, there's a bunch of people from where I went to school that are Fortune 500 CEOs, and so you've got to get away from some of those like stereotypes and biases to get to a good outcome, which is very hard to do if one person is playing all those roles. So if you separate out into hiring committee, right, ultimate decider, and then ultimate manager, you're more likely to get a good decision, right? So ideally, the person who is managing this person won't be the sole decider of who comes in. The sole decider, or the person who has like the ultimate say in the hiring committee, will be high enough that they can sort of see the big picture in the business and help sort of reduce or eliminate bias that might come in from one person on the committee. And then the committee is like objective enough using that structured interview and those competencies and the assessment data to make a really good decision. Now, if you don't have all those resources or you can't do those things, what can you do? Probably the most important thing you could do would be the first two things I mentioned, which is at least come up with a structured interview construct, like come up with a list of questions you want to ask that you feel are relevant to the competencies in the role you're hiring for, and come up with a job simulation where you can actually test against those competencies. If you do those two things and you're really honest with yourself about what's going on, then I think you can make slightly better decisions than you would make. Certainly better decisions than you would make if you weren't doing those things. Slightly better decisions than average if you're going to try to beat that sort of like 40 to 50% hiring success rate?
Structure and comparability. I couldn't agree more. I think it can be hard. I know when I've interviewed, I'm like, I feel like a broken record. But it's important to have the same, to control for as many variables as you can so that you can actually compare. I love that. I want to talk about the role of rest because you kind of, I think, alluded it a little bit earlier when you were talking about like always doing more, and actually it's important to, you mentioned someone taking naps and things. What is important to understand about the role of rest? Because there is a hustle culture in corporate and in entrepreneurship, and there is an element of doing what others won't and outworking people. And I think there is some relevance to that in both entrepreneurship and athleticism, right? Like finessing a skill, honing something does require repetition, and burnout isn't fun. Injury isn't fun. And it can set you back way, way further than intentional rest.
Yeah, I think there's lots to unpack here, but I think that's exactly right. So I think that the first thing to clarify is, similar to the stress principle we talked about earlier, right? Like if you just do too much work, chronic stress, chronic load, you can think about it from like a physical perspective, right? If you go to the gym today and you bench press in the morning and then you rest tomorrow and you bench press again, Thursday, and you rest Friday, and you rest Saturday, and you bench press again Sunday, and you do that for 4 weeks in a row, on week 5, you are going to be stronger than you were today. You will. It may not be 30 pounds stronger, but you will be stronger, okay? If you go to the gym and you bench press today, tomorrow, right? Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, you will not make it to next week without tearing a pec. You just won't, because your body needs recovery to repair your muscles, right? The same thing happens when you sleep, right? When we sleep, what is literally happening is your brain is surrounded by fluid that cleans out toxins in your brain so that you function better. So we need those things to operate at a high level. We've also got all this interesting data about how sleep impacts things like decision making and emotion regulation, and for founders, obviously those things are hugely important. So we've got to start with this understanding that like stress is a necessity, and rest is a necessity. And if you don't take it, like your body will force you to, like it will come, either in burnout or injury, it is going to happen. Now, the trick is being strategic, intentional, thoughtful about when and how to rest. Because I think people often assume that rest means like, oh, I'm taking a week vacation, every quarter, and that's good enough, so I can just grind the rest of the time. But that's not really how human brains or human bodies work. Like we have what's called ultradian rhythms. So we work in sort of like 90-minute cycles, and our energy naturally follows this sort of like cute little curve where it peaks and then drops down again and then kind of peaks again. So even over the course of an hour and a half, like you are not going to be as good in that hour and a half as you are at the beginning or the end or the middle. Like everyone's looks a little different, but somewhere in that 90 minutes, you're going to be doing your best work. And then somewhere in that 90 minutes, you're gonna be doing pretty crappy work, right? So we've got to be like aware of the fact that in that time, your body is already telling you like, hey, there may be a better use of time here. And that sort of hints at the strategic rest. The second thing is we follow circadian rhythms, right? We have like this 24.5-ish hour clock that we naturally run on, during which time we sleep and then do everything else, right? And your body naturally sort of puts you to sleep if you haven't rested. And so you're sort of like evolutionarily programmed to need a break. And you are not going to override 13.7 billion years of evolution. You're just not going to do it. So what can you do instead? You can do strategic, smart, thoughtful, short breaks that will have meaningful impact over time. So what does that look like? That means 5-minute breaks between meetings, 10-minute breaks between meetings, going outside, putting your phone away for 20 minutes, spending time with a loved one, opting out of doom scrolling and instead doing 5 minutes of stretching or yoga. Like it does not have to be a huge commitment, But we know from data that 20 minutes outside of nature is enough to reset your stress levels back to baseline and help you feel recovered. We know that a 20-minute nap after you've done some intensive work actually consolidates your learning and helps you remember something for longer. So we've got all this data that backs up. There's a recent study done that showed that college students who went 3 days on a cell phone without access to anything internet-wise, they just had texting and phone, reported significantly increased levels of happiness and engagement in their life. Like, that is not a huge commitment, right? 3 days of no Google on your phone. Like, they still had Google on the computer, by the way. Like, it just was not on the phone. So it's like these little things really compound over time. And what they're really doing is allowing you to work harder longer, right? But you have to take the break to get to that point. And if you don't, again, your body will force you to do that. So again, I'll summarize super practically for people. Like, what can you do? Prioritize 7 to 8 hours of sleep. There's an incredibly small subset of the population that does not need that much sleep. It is highly unlikely that you are one of those people. So you should just assume that you need 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And that is enough to consolidate your learning. That is enough to let your body repair. By the way, it's enough to activate testosterone and growth hormone and all these other things that are really important for you functioning well. As a bonus, it'll help your decision-making, your emotion regulation. There's even data that shows that leaders who are well rested have more creative, higher impact teams than those who don't. Second would be prioritizing breaks between long strings of things. So, if you've got 3 hours of meetings, finding ways to take 5 or 10 minutes in between meetings, and hour-long meetings at 50 and 30-minute meetings at 25, so you can get up, stretch out, move around, do all those things. Find 15 to 20 minutes a day where you can be outside. Find 15 to 20 minutes a day where you can put your phone away. And then if you have it in you, take one day on the weekend off. If you can do both, great. But if not, that's okay. If you're trying to do something hard, you've got to be realistic that sometimes it may require more time, but more time doesn't mean constant, right? And I think this is what we find with, there's a reason people collapse at the end of marathons, right? Or half marathons. It's all that energy exertion is really hard to maintain over time. And so giving yourself a break is what's going to allow you to do that most effectively without breaking down.
Mm. I can absolutely relate. Thought I was one of those people for very long. And even recently, I have been operating at a much higher capacity, but my body is demanding the sleep. I slept 11 and a half hours one night. I've been sleeping consistently over 8. And it's allowed me to do, to your point, 6 or 7 days a week of work, but with the sleep supporting that work, right? So I'm not letting myself work until 2 a.m, which is very easy for me to do, but I know the toll. I've been through it. I've done it on the injury side as well. And I've learned through both reading and learning, but also through the experience of, I can tell the signals. I'm like, oh, my body is fueling my output work-wise, which is very high right now. We're building a lot of things. We're doing a lot of things, but it's also repairing. It's repairing an injury, and it's building. And it's funny because people in the gym are like, you look amazing. And I'm training less than I have in other phases, but the body is just responding to it. And obviously I'm also, eating the right things and just applying all my learnings from 40 some years of trial and error and education. But I think it's so important, and I love to hear from somebody who sees it on both sides at such an expert level as you. I hope if anyone's listening, find a way to take something from what Alex just said and implement it for the next 6 weeks and see how you feel, right? Do your own experiment.
No doubt. You'll feel much better. That would be my guess.
Can almost guarantee it, There are so many questions I would love to ask you, and I think we will absolutely have to be doing this again, but I want to be mindful of time. And before we jump into a few rapid fire questions, if people are interested to get in touch with you, learn from you, work with you, we'll make sure to put the details in the show notes, but what is the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for having me, and I will come back anytime. The easiest thing to do is just find me on the internet at alexauerbach.com. You can email me there. I answer every email I get. All my social media is there. I'm at Alex Auerbach, PhD on LinkedIn. I don't spend much time on any other platform these days, but happy to have a conversation, and again, really appreciate the opportunity.
Amazing. All right, we've got a few rapid fire questions. One word, one sentence. You can also pass.
All right.
Ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
What's one decision that changed everything for you as a leader?
I know it's supposed to be rapid fire, but am I allowed to think or no?
Absolutely.
One decision that changed everything for me as a leader. Probably leaving my job in Toronto willingly, where I think that was the first time I had an experience of the direct conflict people have between family and work and what that means and how that impacts people.
Yeah. What does strategy feel like when you're doing it well?
Everybody rowing in the same direction.
Is there a book, a podcast, or a person that really cracked something open for you?
7.5 Lessons About the Brain by Lisa Feldman Barrett. Is probably the most important psychology book I read in the last decade.
What's something you've said never again to in your business?
Never again to taking crappy customers.
And if you had a free weekend, 0 obligations, how would you spend it?
Exercise, time outside, time with family, eating good food, getting a good night's sleep.
Sounds divine. Alex, thank you for your generosity, your insights, for joining me here on Builders. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
That's a wrap for this episode of Builders, where we get real about what it actually takes to grow companies that perform without grinding you into the ground. If today's convo sparks something for you, here's what to do next. Follow the show, drop a 5-star review, and share it with someone else who's building big. Don't let it be lonely at the top. If you're ready for more clarity, more leadership freedom, and less of a duct tape and go growth vibe, let's connect. Book your free business breakdown call using the link in the show notes. In 30 minutes, I'll help you pinpoint where blockers in your time, team, or strategy are silently stalling your growth. Walk away with a personalized fix-it list that gives you the clarity you've been craving on what to shift now to regain traction and build momentum. For more tools, insights, and my no-fluff takes on leadership and scaling strategically, join the Builders Club, also linked in the show notes. You can also head over to leaderswhobuild.com, where you'll find all the links to peep my creds, see client wins, or just confirm that yes, I went to the gym today. Until next time, keep leading boldly, building smart, and living success on your terms.